Month, and welcome to Pride Book Fest. I'm Katie Krause, I go by they, them, and I make book recommendations on social media as Katie Reads Books. I'm so excited to bring to you Coming of Age, Love, Sex, Dating, and Coming Out. Today we're going to talk about what it means to come of age as a queer person. So let's meet our panelists.
Hello, I'm Robbie Couch. I'm the author of the young adult book, The Sky Blues, which is a book that's super gay, super queer. And my pronouns are he, him, his. And it's a great book about found family and the power of friendship, and you should check it out.
Hi, I'm Isaac Fitzsimons, and I am the author of The Passing Playbook, which is over my shoulder over there. It is about a trans boy who starts out at a new school where nobody knows he's trans and has to decide whether he wants to come out to fight the ruling after he's benched from the soccer team because of his birth certificate. And it is out June 1st.
Hi, I'm Adiba Khoramm, and I am the author of Honey and Issues, Guide to Fake Dating. It has two covers, that's why I'm showing two covers. My pronouns are she, her, and Honey and Issue is about two Bengali girls who decide to fake date.
Hi, I'm Johnny Garzavia. I wrote 1,500 Miles from the Sun, which is about a Corpus Christi, Texas high school senior who accidentally comes out as gay after getting way too drunk at a party, and the Los Angeles Lost Distance crush who slides into his DMs the next morning. And that will have been out for a few days now. It came out June 8th.
Hi, I'm Emery Lee. I use EM air pronouns. And I'm the author of Meet Cute Diary, a YA trans rom-com about a trans boy, his romance blog, and the fake relationship that he stages in order to save the blog from an internet troll, and that is out now.
Hi, I'm Margot Wood, she, her, and I'm the author of Fresh, which is out on August 3rd, and it is a sex-positive, bisexual retelling of Emma set at freshman year of college at Emerson College, where I went to school.
Awesome. So coming of age is a rather broad term to describe the transition between childhood and adulthood. That period of time is almost always a very different experience for queer youth, specifically in comparison to cisgender straight teens. We know the cis straight narrative because we see it all the time in teen movies, books, and shows. While a lot has changed socially in the last 2 decades, there still isn't enough broad representation of queer coming of age stories. So what does it mean to you to come of age for a queer person? And how does your writing capture that moment different from what's come before?
Okay, so I think I'll start if we're to go in ABC order again. So I think the coming of age genre for queer stories, I think there's much more open-endedness to it because our timelines are can be a little bit shaken up because of our queer identities, I think. Like, I always joke with my friends that we still act like teenagers because we're gay, which is probably not a good excuse. But I think sometimes being queer kind of allows and empowers you to kind of live your own life in your own way. And so a lot of typical conventional things that happen in high school may not happen, or they might kind of manifest in different ways. So I think it can kind of be a blessing because it can challenge you to kind of rethink certain life expectations. And so you can kind of blaze your own path and do things at your own speed. And I think that should be reflected in our own stories, especially like in the YA genre. So I kind of feel like throw the rule book out the window and live your life and don't worry about, meeting certain life benchmarks at certain ages.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And I'll add for my book, I purposely made my character 15 which is younger for YA. It's kind of the dead space in YA, like that 14, 15-year-old. But I wanted him to be 15 because I wanted him to be able to have those life experiences that I think a lot of older people who come out as queer later in life miss out on. But for me, coming of age is sort of a period of self-discovery, and often it begins internally a long time before it comes out externally. And so I think YA has a chance when you get into kind of the close person head of your character to explore those internal and external changes and challenges.
You both had such great answers. I don't even know how to follow that. I think, I agree with both of you. I think coming of age can look very different for queer teens. And I think especially for queer teens of color, because for them, coming of age isn't just about realizing your queerness, but realizing what it means to be queer while you're also a person of color and how these things intersect. And often it can be difficult to do that when you're a teenager. So, I can say for myself, I don't think I really came of age in terms of my queerness and in terms of being a person of color until I was well into my adulthood. So I think writing these YA stories that are coming of age, it's filling the space that hasn't really been filled up before, and being able to explore this very specific or these very specific coming of age stories that haven't really existed before, and that show where these kind of intersections are, and how coming of age as even like a white queer person can look very different from coming of age as a queer person of color.
I myself see coming of age as like whatever stakes the main character is involved in both present this very adult feeling situation that's like this hugest thing that this person has ever felt before, but also at the same time reminds them of how little power they have. And usually it's because of age or because they don't have all of the tools at hand to properly go at this, and like at least not by themselves. I like to think of movies like Unpregnant or I'm No Longer Here that just really perfectly encapsulate that feeling of adolescence, and especially being at like 17, 18, 19, where we feel so close to independence, but also like while being at this most significant part of our lives, we also simultaneously just feel so beaten by life, like the hardest that we've ever felt, like ever, and reminded of how little we know, how much growing we still have to do, and how young we still are. And like tied to that, I think coming of age is a really broad term that can mean just so many things, especially in the queer experience, because no one's experience is exactly like anyone else's. Getting into college at 18 was a coming of age experience for me, knowing I was moving away and maybe would have the opportunity at some point to not be so constrained by my entire life up to that point, but also coming out at 21 and doing drag for the first time at like 24, and that opening up the ability for me to discover my own gender identity were both also coming of age experiences. And there's just this huge beauty in the scope of the ways that we can find ourselves in that moment as queer people. And I think my writing in particular and the stories that I tell are unique in this way because, like, honestly, like, we really can't name any other contemporary gay or even just some part of the mafia, the alphabet mafia, Mexican American story that's just out right now this minute and is also not historical fiction, and like that actually encapsulates the world that we live in today. I don't think you can. And I don't say that to be like, oh, I've won this game, but like more is just sadness that what I write is unique right now, and I know it won't be for very much longer. But like Chicana teens looking for characters who they can relate to and who they can come of age with and experience both the beauty and all the mierda that is stepping closer to adulthood in our community, like that's unique right now. And like I think that needs to not be so unique.
Yeah, I really liked what you said about the whole like you're kind of on the brink of adulthood, but not really an adult yet. So in Fresh, I really am interested in like what happens after you come out. Like I don't think coming of age is just that like figuring out your sexuality and like that's when it stops. You've come of age now, and now you're officially an adult. So it's more for me. It's a coming of age is about like once you've figured some things out, it's like trying to figure out everything else by process of elimination, by just trying a whole bunch of things and just seeing what works and what doesn't work. And so I think that's what I'm really interested in reading about, especially in the YA space. Like, my book's set in college and there aren't that many, because we don't have an official category, new adult isn't really a thing. So there is, like you said, there was a gap with a 15-year-old, and there's also a gap with these like 19-year-olds as well, because it sort of seems like YA is like after they get out of high school, it's like, oh, YA is done. So I am kind of excited to explore the area of like coming of age outside of high school and what that means, and when you're on your own and all the nonsense you can get into.
I feel like I related a lot, like both to like what Adiba and Johnny said, like with just like in regards to like the difference of like there are queer stories out there, and like I read queer stories for as long as like I could find them. But like at the same time, to look at like a queer person of color, like someone who has like a similar experience to myself, even just like finding like a trans person of color, I don't think I found a single one until 2020, and that's like outrageous. And then you add like other intersections, and you add like someone who actually fits like your racial and like ethnicity, like it's just very like not a thing. I feel like it's really easy to find. And like again, like what Adib was saying about like the difference in like our actual coming of age experiences, like I feel like in a way I had multiple coming of ages, because you know as a teen I was spending my time coping with being the only Black kid at my school, and like coping with, you know, trying to figure out like, do I dislike my body, or is that the way that people have made me feel because I don't look like anyone else around me? And so I think only when I hit college and like I was able to be comfortable in myself and like know what was racism and what wasn't, was I able to then say, you're right, I feel uncomfortable with my body because I'm trans. So I think that's like a huge thing that a lot of people don't realize is like, for when you're combining intersections of like identity, like the ability to even figure out your queer identity is so much different just because of how like your other identities will come into play. And so I think like with my book, my book is not strictly a coming of age story. It's genre fiction, so it's a rom-com. But I think ultimately it kind of came down to wanting to show that like a queer story with a teenager is not necessarily, you know, following the same coming out and like figuring out like the same like romance and sex and like kind of like plot beats that like as, you know, a trans person of color who's like, you know, gay and like dealing with like all these like different intersections and like these different like elements of the story, his focus is on love. And so all he wants is to find like the perfect romance. And so while there are these little like elements that are like kind of seen in the traditional coming of age narrative that kind of like sprinkle throughout, ultimately his focus is on one thing, and that thing is like finding romance. And so I feel like it's a lot different than like the way that you would normally see a coming of age story, because the focus isn't his identity. It just shows how identity naturally progresses as you go through life. And so therefore you don't necessarily have to come to terms with all of it at once. Like you can have one part that you come to terms with, and then other things that kind of come and grow as you go and as you change and as you meet new people and like enter new stages of your life.
So y'all kind of touched on this, but queer coming of age stories have definitely significantly changed over the last decade, where most of them were centered around trauma. And now, especially with the books on this panel, we're seeing nuanced stories with love and romance and conflict that's not centered on trauma. So that in mind, what's the most challenging aspect of writing a queer coming of age story today?
Cool, I'll dive in. And I feel bad for hogging the first spot every time. So if you want to change up the order, that's totally cool.
You are welcome to that first spot.
Okay. I would say probably the most challenging aspect that I found writing queer YA is the fact that we still don't have, like we've certainly made big strides forward in terms of expanding representation for queer people and queer readers, but at the same time, we still don't have that broad spectrum of queer representation. I think especially if you're a person of color, especially if you're trans, there's other marginalized groups that still don't have enough stories out there representing their experiences. So if you're writing a story that fits into a queer category, you're going to have so many hungry readers looking for their own story in your book. And I don't think it's possible for any singular story to represent every queer person's experience. So it's challenging because you kind of have those expectations to have a story that represents your community, but at the same time, it's sort of an impossible standard. So I think that just speaks to the importance of having more queer stories across the spectrum of our community, so that all of us and all of our readers can look to pop culture and look to books and see ourselves represented in the entertainment and the books and films and TV around us. But we're still not quite there yet. So I think it's tough, because you want to be able to have all the stories in the world that represent everyone's experiences, but because we're still limited in our access to be able to get those stories out there, it can be a conundrum. So I think that's, for me, is probably the most challenging aspect to it.
Yeah, I would chime in on there and say on the publishing side, the hardest part of getting a queer story, writing a queer story and getting it published is the publishers still love trauma, queer trauma, you know, and that's all they want to read and that's all they want to publish. And so it's really difficult it's amazing to see so many books like ours like get through the door that don't center trauma. But like I will say, the vast majority of queer writers today are going to face at some point during the publishing process, editor or publisher or salesperson on the marketing team or whatever, just be like, well, this isn't sad or depressing enough. So I would say that's probably a really difficult thing for writers today, queer writers today.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, you can go first. It's okay.
I was just gonna say, I feel like diving in, like based on like what Robbie and Margot said, is I feel like it's very much a real thing, and I feel like it's so hard too, because like publishing has this very narrow view of like what can sell, and they have this idea that like what can sell is only what has sold before. And so when you're showing up here and you're saying, hey, I want to write a rom-com with like a trans multiracial character, and everyone's like, what is that? What does that mean? And it's like, unless they've seen it before, it doesn't exist. And like, they don't know how to market it. They tell you that you can't sell it, that nobody wants to read it. And so I feel like you kind of fall into this cycle where it's like, only the first people who were allowed through the door are the same types of people who still get allowed through the door. And so I feel like the longer it takes and the harder it is for like authors of different identities to kind of break through, the more difficult it becomes cumulatively later as more people try to like follow in those footsteps. And it becomes very much like if that one book that we gave one shot to in like 2014 that we didn't market at all failed, then nobody else who fits that identity will ever be allowed to publish something ever again. And it just leaves us so trapped. Like, and like Robbie was saying, like, I feel like the only way you can really fix that is to have more books out there. But as long as publishing kind of feels like it can't publish anything that hasn't been published before, it's just a continuous cycle.
Yeah, I guess kind of reiterating what Emery said, because my points were very similar, is that you can get through the door of not writing those queer trauma books anymore, but still get so much pushback just because of the kind of how you've been pigeonholed and how your stories have been pigeonholed. And again, going back to, being a queer person of color, and specifically actually writing queer Muslim stories, this has been incredibly challenging because for my debut, The Henna Wars, my character, Nishat, she had parents who at first kind of rejected her identity when she came out to them. And a lot of readers kind of resonated with that. And then with the second book, Honey and Issues Guide to Fake Dating, Honey, who is Muslim and queer, her parents are incredibly accepting of her, but her friends who are actually white and not Muslim aren't accepting. And so some of the early pushback I've seen is people saying, it's just really bad representation that Muslim parents would, accept her. And, I think this is not like a unique experience just to writing queer Muslim stories, but it is the kind of pushback that a lot of queer people of color face, where we're told that we have to write a very specific experience, which does, center some kind of trauma, which has to be like very emotional, has to like make you cry. But obviously, queer people of color have all kinds of stories. They have those emotional stories, those trauma stories, but also those, rom-coms, those happy endings and all of that. So I think just like trying to push back against pigeonholing is a very big challenge, especially for queer people of color.
I'm really glad that we all seem to just be on the same brave but honest take here. I was like, oh my god. But yeah, publishing, if we're all just going to be completely honest, publishing is the biggest challenge right now that we face, because I, at least right now, don't necessarily push trauma out the door. My stories are joyful and I think they're funny. I don't know, they might not be funny, but they also coexist with trauma. And because of that, I recognize that there's a special sort of resilience you have to have whenever you get into publishing. I remember listening to this podcast where Gabby Rivera was on, and she was talking about the power of including both joy and pain or trauma in queer stories. And that's just because it's a very real experience, not just as a human, but even more so as a queer person just trying to exist. And I didn't want to not recognize the trauma, but I also didn't want to lessen any amount of the joy in my book in any way. And I constantly think about how I was pushed multiple times to add more sadness, add more trauma, add more conflict, especially to parts and to relationships that I had been very adamant about keeping as trauma-free as possible. And I had to vocalize that, just every single time. I had to make sure that everyone knew the places where I would move and would work with them, but at the same time, also the ones where I was going to be very firm about just no thank you. And I know this isn't like a rare thing. Like, obviously, like we've all kind of spoken on this, and like to the people who give us advances, trauma makes their money back to them. And so like trying to write that story that we want to tell can really stifle that.
Yeah, I would agree with what everybody says. I think everybody kind of hit the nail on the head. With my book, which is about a trans character, and often in trans narratives, the big climax scene is a traumatic outing scene. And you see that time and time again. And I was like, I don't want that in my book. And so when I was like querying, I would have agents say, no, I really love this book, but you need to have like more conflict with him being outed. And I'm like, that's not what I'm going to do. I was really fortunate that my editor was completely on board, and even there were scenes where she would read it and was like, do you really want trans readers to see that play out on the page? Like, is this harmful for trans readers? And it got me to reflect on what I had internalized as being necessary in queer stories based on like what actually isn't necessary. Like, you don't need to see that trauma played out on the page. I think there's definitely a place and time for it, and it belongs in books, and readers should have that choice to read books that do go more deeply into the trauma. But like everyone says, the joy is just as important to have. And so like the most difficult part was just kind of finding other ways, more creative ways, I think, to portray that conflict that doesn't lead to a character getting harmed.
So, as I mentioned already, a major aspect of coming of age for queer folks is coming out. So how does the coming out experience play a role in your book, either on or off page? And what was the most important part of the queer experience that you wanted to be sure to include?
So yeah, for me, so in my book, The Sky Blues, Sky Baker, the main character, is already out when you meet him, right in chapter 1. He came out a few months prior to the book beginning, and it was pretty intentional for me not to write a coming out story. And I have nothing against coming out stories. I feel like sometimes folks will kind of misconstrue what I'm saying as though I'm against coming out stories. I'm not at all. But I do feel like sometimes they can be sort of queer stories can kind of be pigeonholed into like that coming out narrative. And I wanted to do something a little bit different with The Sky Blues, where you meet him right after he is out, but he's still learning how to navigate the world in like a queer body, moving through the world where he's facing homophobic harassment and family rejection, and he's dealing with those things in a new way because he's out for the first time. And so I kind of wanted to explore that post coming out period where you're experiencing the highs of finally feeling empowered that you're visible and you're out there as an openly queer person, but at the same time, the lows of having to deal with more blatant homophobia or transphobia or however it exists. In Sky's case, it was homophobia. So that was really important for me to kind of not tell that conventional coming out story, but I shouldn't even say conventional coming out story because there's so many different ways to come out, but to kind of explore that post coming out period of trying to figure out who you are and trying to kind of feel comfortable with the new normal moving through the world as a openly queer person.
Something about coming out is that sometimes it's not only a one-time thing. It's kind of a constant, having to come out to different people. And so my character Spencer, he's out as trans. He's come out as trans. And I do include a scene where he comes out to his mom for the first time. And I think that's like one of the only scenes that really didn't change from the first time I wrote it, just because I got to pour out all of my feelings onto the page and it's kind of stayed there. But then throughout the book, Spencer is determining who is safe to come out to. And so the message that I kind of wanted to get across to readers was that it's not enough to declare yourself an ally in a safe space. You have to actively show that you are a person. And this goes for queer and non-queer people, that you are a safe person for somebody to come out to, and that takes a lot of work.
Yeah, I think for me, my book actually combines both like what Robbie and Isaac were saying. Like I have my main character, he's trans and he's already out by the time the book starts. He like quickly touches upon like having come out like a few weeks before. And something that people had asked for a lot was like, can we get his coming out? And I was like, no, because ultimately like the whole goal of the book was to show a trans person who, you know, he comes out, everyone accepts him, he's good, life is great, like he's not worried about those types of things, he's moved on from the coming out, and now he's all about just like, you know, living his life, finding his romance. But on the other hand, I have a character, Devin, who throughout the course of the story is kind of changing identity markers, changing pronouns, kind of going through this like, this journey of like, does this label fit? Should I change to something else? Am I allowed to go back on a label that I previously said did work for me? And so it's kind of like, I wanted to show that kind of cycle, like Isaac was saying, like where you don't necessarily come out once and that's it, everything's done and life is like good. Like there's, for the most part, like as people, we have to come out again and again and again, every time you meet new people, every time you're in a new situation, every time you move. And so for Devin, it's kind of like that thing where like, he's now like figuring out, this is a label, but then if I want to change that label, like I have to come out again and I have to like tell people and like find people who are going to support that. So for Devin, the story is a lot about like finding someone, in this case, Noah, that you can lean on and kind of be like, here is my new identity. Like I'm coming out again and again, but like getting that support so that it's something that is not like a painful thing to do.
I really like that about your book. So in Honey and Issue, actually something kind of similar to Emery's book. I have two main characters, Honey and Issue, and they have different coming out experiences. So Honey is actually out to her parents and they're very accepting of her. And towards the beginning of the book, she decides to come out to her white Irish friends, and they tell her that she can't be bisexual if she has never kissed a girl, which is what leads to her, deciding to fake date Issue. So her coming out, she has one coming out, but then to her family, she is already out. So it's kind of two different coming out stories, just, in Honey's experience, because obviously all of us have to come out like all the time. So, it felt authentic to experiences that I've had. And then with Issue, obviously when she starts fake dating Honey, she kind of has to come out to, the school and to Honey's friends. But she actually, throughout the course of the book, she never comes out to anyone. It's never like a scene where she sits someone down and she's like, hey, like, this is my identity. And, she, even when she's fake dating Honey, she never comes out to her parents. And she even says to her, I can't be out to my parents. And Honey's like, okay, that's cool. So for me, it was really important to kind of explore that you can be queer and you don't have to come out, and you can be queer and you can come out if you feel comfortable doing that. I just wanted to explore like a variety of coming out or not coming out experiences and just show that, you can be queer in so many different ways.
Yeah, in 1500 Miles from the Sun, for Jules as a main character, coming out is basically the inciting incident of the book. Like it's a coming out book. Like the coming out trope is there, and everything that happens in literally the year after, and all those stakes there are because of that one decision. But I wanted to take it like in a different perspective, because like we have seen the coming out trope used in a variety of media, but like I really wanted to think on the idea of like, what would Simon Spears' journey look like if he was a gay South Texan Mexican American, right now? How would that look different? Because it would look very different. It would be a lot different. And just like really go into detail on how that and how like all the identities that Jules is kind of plays a part in his coming out process and how people react or embrace or reject him. But I also wanted to portray like coming out and not only embracing our queerness, but also like even those who maybe don't even realize their queerness yet. I wanted to have all those different experiences in this story. Like we have also Matt, who came out to a very supportive family with older queer siblings. And we have a character who is just so boisterous and lively, but then comes out so quietly and intimately to Jules. And we have another character who is queer, but it hasn't clicked yet. And like, that's totally okay, because like, it doesn't have to click when you're like 5, 6, 15, 16. Like it can be later in life, and that's totally just as valid. So I wanted to make sure that like all of those different experiences were present in this book.
So one of the criticisms that I read of Fresh earlier on was that it felt like a utopic society because everybody's so accepting. Like nobody comes out in Fresh, but there's tons of queer, gay, bisexual people. Like there's just, everybody is gay. And the thing is that where I went to college, Emerson, it really is a utopic gay society. Like the unofficial slogan is "Gay by May" or "Your money back." And so that's one of the things that, like, while I can see that it from a perspective of somebody that maybe didn't go to Emerson, that it feels like unrealistic. It actually was my experience at Emerson. Everybody was just very open with their sexuality. So in Freshen, that's part of it. That's part of the Emerson culture there. But it's also like, the story of Elliot. She knows that she's bisexual. That's never in question or anything. Some people do try to put labels on her without, her consent. And she's just like, that's not me. But what she is trying to figure out, and I guess there is some sort of semi close to coming out scene, is more about how she feels romantically. So she knows what she is sexually, but she doesn't quite know where she lands on the romantic side of things. So even though she thinks that she's exploring her sexuality and what she likes in the bedroom and, what kind of sex she wants to have, it's actually more of a story of her trying to figure out what she needs and wants romantically. So there is like a couple of moments where she has like some revelations with herself. So if anything, she's coming out to herself than anybody else, but nobody comes out in Fresh. Yeah.
So coming out is usually not the only part of someone's self-discovery. So how does your book separate coming out from the coming of age experience?
Cool. I will gladly go first again, but again, anyone can jump in if they want to. I would say for me, because Sky Baker is already out, right, when you meet him in chapter 1, it's sort of inherently not a coming out journey for him. So it's pretty clear to the reader from page 1 that it's not a coming out story. But sort of what I touched on with my previous answer, I really wanted to explore that post coming out period, that to have Sky Baker moving through the world as like a visibly queer person or openly queer person, what that meant for him, all the ramifications it meant for his relationships, his friendships, his love interests, and the consequences of being out for the first time, both positive and negative. So I think it kind of innately wasn't a coming out story, and that was pretty clear from page 1, but it was sort of exploring that post coming out awkwardness and weirdness for a lot of queer people who experience that weird period of their life after they come out.
I can go next if nobody else wants to go. In Honey and Issues Guide to Fake Dating, coming of age and coming out actually never really intersect, I think, because both of the characters are pretty comfortable in their sexuality from the beginning of the book, even though Honey does come out to her friends, and that's kind of what starts, the whole story, the whole fake dating plot. But she is already pretty comfortable in her sexuality, and that is why she feels comfortable coming out to her friends. And she's kind of taken by surprise at their response. But both of their coming of age is very separate from like their queerness. It's from their coming out rather than their queerness. But it is for them about, accepting who they are fully, especially for Honey. It's about accepting who she is and being comfortable with that to all the people around her. And for Issue, it's more like about, I guess, being okay with being herself and being okay with not having to impress her parents all the time for everything. Coming out and coming of age are very, very different things in Honey and Issue, and they don't really ever intersect.
I think that's like the same for Meet Cute Diary for the most part. I mean, Noah's whole story, like I said, is about like finding romance. And so by the time the story starts, he's known in his mind that he's been trans for a few years. He's been out online for a few years. And so even though he just came out a few weeks ago, like by the time, the story begins, he's like, I'm trans, I'm here. Like everyone who has a problem with that can just suck it. Like it has nothing to do with them. And so like, I don't think there's really any, like his journey is basically learning how to build healthy relationships and learning how to like, kind of like stop trying to control everything in his life so heavily that he's sabotaging himself. And so I don't really think that like coming out actually plays into his coming of age at all. It's just kind of like something that he had to do so that he can now have this story and like this journey that he's on.
For my book, I really wanted coming out to serve as like a tool for like pushing Jules just really forward, but like into a but I wanted to separate it from like the things that make his story a coming of age story. Like from the get-go, we know that the coming of age journey for Jules centers on getting into college and on getting into a very specific college. He wants to go to UCLA, and we're stuck in this idea that moving far away will be the solution to all his problems that come from what forces him to have stayed closeted for like up until that moment. And like also just like realizing everything then that he's also leaving, and the realization that he won't have his friends anymore if he moves from Corpus Christi, Texas, all the way to Los Angeles, California, and he won't have his sister, and he won't have his widow, and like coming to terms with the huge amount of independence this means for him, but would also come with getting what he's wanted for years now, and it's basically his entire personality. And I wanted to make sure that the experience of Jules coming out to his dad even was not the same as the moment that Jules makes a very impactful adult decision on who gets to be in his life and prioritizing his own physical and emotional and mental well-being over hoping that the person who's supposed to love him one day will wake up and have change. Like I wanted those to be like two different experiences where like we can see growth and like see him kind of going into his own introduction to adulthood. And ultimately, I think like coming out, as everyone I think has said now, is just the thing that we do our entire lives, and it can like vary in meaning. Like sometimes it's really scary, but other times it's like, oh yeah, girl, like I'm gay. What about it? And so like I didn't want to tie that very specific and often small moment into something that like really ties into a coming of age trope.
Yeah, coming out and coming of age don't really intersect in Fresh. It's definitely more of a coming of age story, and it's about just what it's like being a freshman, specifically a freshman in college, because it is the most unique year for you when you're in school and being away for the first time. So, yeah, they definitely don't intersect though.
Yeah, and in mine, my character, he's only 15, so he's pretty young, so he's still kind of on the brink of that coming of age experience. But something that I really enjoyed exploring was his parents and their reaction to him coming out. So his parents are very supportive, but I included a couple scenes. Like there's one where he wants to have his crush have a sleepover, and his mom has to navigate her feelings around that. Like if he hadn't transitioned, would she allow him to have a boy over? But he's gay. But like there was it was sort of fun to kind of to explore those things. And then there was a moment where his parents give him like a safe sex talk. And again, the question is like, does mom do it? Does dad do it? Would this have changed if he hadn't transitioned? And so I got to play with those sort of coming of age moments that you have with your parents, but how does it look when you have a character who is gender nonconforming or queer? And so I had a lot of fun doing that with parents who are alive and active and accepting.
So let's pivot to first love. A major part of coming of age is experiencing first love, whether it's just a crush, a promise, some hand-holding, a first kiss, or a full-blown relationship. We all know that your first experience with love can be awkward and messy. So what was your favorite aspect of writing about first loves, and what did you feel was the most important aspect of these experiences that you wanted to underscore for young readers?
For me in the Sky Blues, and sorry about the location change, I'm now sitting on a kid's stool in a playpen. So, you know, the joys of remote virtual events. But yeah, for the Sky Blues, something that I really had fun with in terms of Sky's journey was the idea of kind of challenging assumptions with the people around him. And I don't want to give anything away or give any spoilers away because it's happened before on events, but he kind of sees a lot of the people in his life, whether it's his family members, his friends, his potential love interests in certain ways. And then throughout the book, those assumptions about who those other characters are challenged in ways that really make him rethink his perspectives and also challenge and also enlighten him in terms of his own privileges as a white cisgender person in his town. And one fun aspect of that when it came to his love interest was kind of seeing people kind of in one-dimensional ways and having them surprise him in the best possible way so that he is able to kind of relate to them and connect with them in really fun, romantic ways. And I'm going to shut up now before I give away a spoiler. But I think that was probably the best part of writing Sky's love interest arc.
Robbie is the Tom Holland of our panel, right? For Honey and Issues Guide to Fake Dating, so for Honey, she has kind of dated boys before. She hasn't really enjoyed it too much. And then Issue is her first, it's her fake relationship, but it's her first time, experiencing anything like that with a girl. And for Issue, she is somebody she's like a nerd. She loves studying, and that's basically her entire life. She's very antisocial. She doesn't have any friends, really. So they're two very different characters, and they come to this fake dating scheme with varied experience. So one of the most fun things about writing this experience of first love is actually how Issue kind of reacts to it, because towards the beginning, when they're kind of figuring out what their rules for fake dating are going to be, Issue asks Honey, she's like, what if I do it wrong? And she's like, what do you mean? Like, how can you like date someone wrong? And she's like, I don't know, like I've never done this before. So I really enjoyed like writing these kinds of things about these characters, kind of figuring out how to actually date each other, even if they're doing it in a fake way, because they've just never done this before in this way, and that was just super fun to write for me.
So in Fresh, there is a sex montage, an entire chapter where Ellie at the beginning of the story, when we plop in at the very beginning, she's slept with both men and women at this point, but that's about all she's done is like the very basic stuff. And so she's like, I want to know, like, I've had sex, but I don't know what good sex is. So she goes on this sex montage that was really fun to write. And so she tries a lot of different things, polyamory and, some dom sub relationships. And she tries a couple of different things. And she's trying to figure out what it is that she actually really likes. And I would say that when we're talking about what she experienced, and she's had sex, lots of sex and all this stuff, she's very comfortable with sex, except that she's not comfortable with opening herself up to the other person that she's sleeping with in an emotional way. And so for her, like, I don't want to give too much away, but that's really the first that she does experience in the book is how to connect with somebody sexually, but also, on a deeper level emotionally while you're having sex. So.
Yeah, I got to write about a long distance relationship and how love blossoms from being like at two very far apart points, which was so much fun. If also like entirely very much just me constantly being like, okay, do they get to meet? They better get to meet soon, and I very much hate this. But I wanted to give like validity to social media and to specifically its significance to queer people, and even more so young queer people, and how relationships can come from that. Like, I mean, who really hasn't had a social media crush, right? Like literally everyone. And at its core, I don't know, I wanted to write about two boys who knew in their hearts that the other one was worth it, that their attraction for each other is just as valid as any couple who gets to experience a relationship physically together from the very beginning. And that for Jules, out of every single option that could exist in Corpus Christi, Texas, he'd still pick Matt. And for Matt, out of every single option in Los Angeles, California, it's still Jules. And like, that can be so inexplicable, I think, to a lot of people, but it doesn't make it any less real. And I think in the end, like the yearning involved in all of that was definitely my favorite part.
I want to know who everybody's social media crushes are now.
We're not going there.
I have way too many to go there right now.
Emery, I saw that you were going to speak, so I didn't speak.
Oh, do you want me to go?
speak? No, yeah, no.
I was gonna say, I feel like Johnny and I have like a lot of similar elements in our books, but like if you did them in the exact opposite way, like it's like basically what happened. I feel like there, but I feel like with mine it was similar concept where I wanted to bring in social media and like how pivotal it is like as a queer person, but especially like as a queer teenager where you don't really control like the elements of your life. You can't control who you meet or like where you go, and like you're very like trapped. But I feel like the biggest like lesson in Meet Cute Diary, at least for Noah, is just kind of that like the perfect romance is not necessarily going to play out the way that you think it will. And I think that was huge just because I feel like for a lot of people, especially like in this day and age, like especially a lot of teens, like you grow up and you see all these relationships on social media, you see these relationships in movies and books and TV, and like you start to think this is what a relationship looks like well before you ever have a chance to actually explore like a real world relationship. And I think that can kind of distort your perception of like what to look for, what's good, what's like, you know, versus what just kind of like looks good on paper. And so a lot of Noah's story, and I think this is like probably the funnest thing about it, was just kind of taking all of his expectations of like, this is what would work in a rom-com, this is what would work in a movie, and like this is what feels good to post on like for like all of my fans, and just kind of like flipping it and making like all these things that should be cute into kind of like disasters, and all these things that should be absolute disasters into like these like romantic little moments. And so I think that was just kind of like the message I kind of wanted to give teens is like, you know, love is out there and like we love exploring it and we love reading about it, but also keep in mind that like fiction is fiction, and even social media is like to a certain extent not fully authentic. So, you know, just because something sounds good doesn't mean that's necessarily what you want. Like you have to figure out what actually works for you and what actually makes you happy, and like that's where you like develop your relationship.
For me, I loved writing the awkward moments between my main character and his love interest. And I think, so this is me putting on my psychology hat, there's like this really normal phase in adolescent development where you feel like you are the center of everyone else's world, and you feel really self-conscious. You feel like there's a microscope or like over you. And so, and that means like both positive and negative. So like you see somebody looking at you and like, oh, maybe they like me, but also maybe they hate me and they think that I'm ugly. And so I loved getting to explore that with my character, where there is a kind of a bit of whiplash with him and his feelings for his love interest, because he just doesn't know what the love interest feels about him. So my advice would, or the message really, is kind of embrace the awkwardness. And most people are too involved with themselves to really care about like what's going on with you. So you don't need to worry about that at all.
So in crafting a good love story, there has to be a solid love interest. What goes into creating a solid love interest, and what are the necessary ingredients?
For me, like the only necessary ingredient in a love interest is that they have to be the opposite of the main character in all the right ways. So ultimately, I feel like if you have two characters who are too similar, then like they can't hold each other up. If you have two characters who are different in all the wrong ways, they can't hold each other up. But if you get two characters who are perfectly opposed to each other in just the right ways, they'll keep each other standing. And so ultimately, that's kind of just how I like approach like the perfect love interest, is just how do I fill those gaps? How do I counteract those weaknesses in the main character? How do I build on that main character's strengths?
Mm-hmm. I completely second Emery. I think your love interest should be a foil to your main character. Or though in my book they're both main characters, but they're also love interests, so they have to act as foils to each other. And so by the end of the book, you should clearly be able to see how their romance is bringing out the best in each other.
I would like definitely say like they Adib and Emery definitely like hit it perfectly, and just like how a good love interest needs to in some way complement the main character. And like it's not to say that you have to follow a specific trope or a specific pair of personalities in order to make it work, but you have to ask yourself why. I think like the main character, why does the main character specifically want that person, and what makes that person so special to them? And then on the other side of that, like what makes the main character so attractive to the love interest? And you know, we need that reasoning, because reasoning creates tension and it creates yearning and it creates movement forward. I feel like the worst thing in my heart is just whenever there's like a romantic arc or plot or storyline and like the tension or conflict happens and like the main character is like, oh my god, no, I've never felt this sad before. And it's like, when were you ever actually in love with this person? Because I missed it. Like I've been reading from page 1 and I missed where there was any sort of actual attraction happening. And like that's just the worst. And so like you need some kind of reasoning behind it as well, I think.
I would echo what everybody said. There's a quote from somebody, I don't know who it was, and I looked it up, but I couldn't find it. But it's, if your main character is an arsonist, then the love interest should be a firefighter. And when I looked it up, all I could find were firefighters turned arsonists. Apparently there are a lot of them out there. But yeah, so
we
kind of
can
the same
pretend
thing.
that you made it up. We'll give you credit for it.
Okay. But then also on the other side, there should be like legitimate reasons why they shouldn't be together or why they can't be together initially. Otherwise, like what's keeping them apart? What's that tension there?
Everybody just said everything so much more eloquently. So I co-sign everything.
I would say I agree with that, Margot. Those were terrific answers. I also would say for me, and this isn't necessarily like a necessary ingredient, but I really enjoyed in the Sky Blues having the love interest see something in Sky that Sky perceives as a flaw or an insecurity or something that makes him very vulnerable, but his love interest sees it as a strength and sees it as very cool and kind of flips Sky's own perception of himself in a very neat way. And I think playing with vulnerabilities and our own perceptions of ourselves and what our strengths are, weaknesses are, I think that can be a really cool tool to develop that sort of chemistry and kind of help your characters see in themselves what other people see in them too. So yeah.
And when talking about first love and new intimate experiences, one of the most captivating aspects of young adult books is the dichotomy between the protagonist's inner conflict with themselves and the outer conflict with others. Can you talk about what it's like to craft a believable teen voice experiencing the throes of first love, and how do you do that in a believable way?
I think first of all, like you need to go where youth culture is. Like, I mean, right now, for example, I think if you want to know how teenagers act and talk and their humor and what appeals to them and what they think about romance and crushes, you should probably be on TikTok. But also, like, I talk to my friends who have a lot of younger cousins, especially about the way they talk and act as Chicana teens living in Texas, because like the way an abuelita talks and thinks is going to be different than the way a 17-year-old talks and thinks. And even just the way a teenager in Laredo talks is going to be different than how someone in Los Angeles or even Dallas talks. And two, like I feel like you need to consume media and think critically about it. There's a lot of wonderful YA books out there that I just genuinely believe also don't have an appealing voice, and like that's okay. But also, like I think it's like, important to be able to identify the ways those books are terrific and really like do the damn thing, but also like the ways that they just make some choices that like you or me as a writer writing teenagers would never make, and like being able to develop our own writing style from that. And lastly, like just go into it honestly and respectfully. Like none of us are going to get it 100% right because we're not 17, 16, 15-year-olds. Like it's not going to be perfect, and like you have to really embrace that and just do your best and want to do right for your audience. That's going to do a lot.
Yeah, I second everything that Johnny said. I think the most important thing is to kind of immerse yourself in like youth culture. And, you know, obviously sometimes that's difficult. For me, it's easy because I have like a 17-year-old sister. But you know, like Johnny said, consuming a lot of media that is specifically meant for teens and looking at what kind of voice these types of media are capturing. You know, reading a lot of YA books. Reading has definitely helped me kind of curate that very specific teen voice. If you know you have family members who are teens, or you know, I'm a teacher, so I used to be able to meet with a lot of teens just while doing my day job, which was very helpful. So I think figuring out where you can kind of immerse yourself in these kinds of voices, because the more you listen to them, the more authentically you can write it.
I actually think sometimes adult writers who are writing teenagers can sometimes try too hard to sound like teenagers. I know I've read a lot of YA books where I'm just like, oh, like this sounds so like they're just using every like buzzword that kids are using that particular summer when they wrote it, which is now outdated. And I also think that there's a tendency for us older adults who are writing YA to be too self-aware of like what teenagers should be doing. You know what I mean? Like if I'm writing from a first person perspective, like she can't be all knowing about these decisions that she's making are bad, because like, of course I know them now as an adult, but like she doesn't know that. So there was a lot of times where I had to go back and be like, she would not know that this was like she would not think this, like this would not come to her mind because she's not an adult. She doesn't have that perspective. So I would say trying to remember to step outside of yourself as an adult and try to remember and think back to like when you were a teenager yourself, like you thought you knew and understood everything, and just like that raw confidence that teenagers have, I love. But trying not to confuse it too much with what you know now as an adult is really important.
I think everybody has captured what I would say. And I want to emphasize Johnny's point about treating teens with respect, because they are intelligent, they are engaged, they are aware, and just keeping that in mind as you're writing and not sort of pandering to them, but treating them as like human beings, because that is what they are.
Yeah, totally echoing kind of a blend of Isaac, Johnny, and Marco's responses, where I feel like my biggest, or one of my biggest pet peeves with reading YA sometimes is when adults write in a very condescending way. And it's like, yes, they're teenagers, but they're not aliens. Like they're human beings, and they have many of the same emotions and experiences that adults do. And of course there's differences, and it's very important to stay tuned into a lot of media and social media that younger people are using, of course. But yeah, it really is not fun when you when you read a YA that feels like, okay, clearly someone who was not 16 was writing this and trying very hard to sound 16.
I like agree with everything that everybody's saying, but I'm actually gonna go like against the tide here and like say something totally like kind of contradictory. But as somebody who was reading YA a lot when I was YA aged, I never, as a teenager, picked up a book that actually sounded like a teenager. Every single book, and I think that's something that like adults kind of like forget or like try too hard about. It's like, how can I sound like a teenager? And it's like, you can't. And like, even if you write for people who are 17 right now, by the time that book comes out, those people are going to be 20, and the people who are reading your book are not going to feel like that voice is authentic either. And it's like, my argument ultimately is always, believable is a farce. It's not true. It doesn't exist. Believable is whatever the reader feels rings true to them. And so ultimately, there is no way to write anything that is fully believable, because there will always be readers who think, what the hell is this? This doesn't make any sense. And like, at the end of the day, like, I think I've gotten a lot of feedback on like books that I write, or like friends' books, where people will say something like, wow, this voice is such an authentic teen voice. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, it's not. I'm not a teenager. Like, I did not write this to sound like an authentic teenager. Like, I wrote this to get the story across, to make the characters make sense, to present the message that I'm trying to present in this book. And so I think ultimately, like, when I was 15, I didn't care that the characters sounded 24, as long as they were giving me a good story, as long as I liked them, as long as I liked the world, as long as the story was, you know, bringing me something. And so ultimately, I think the message is just, you know, don't focus on trying to make your characters like believable or authentic, because ultimately, to a certain extent, they never will be, you know. And like, it's good to bring a piece of yourself into it. It's good to like respect the audience that you're writing for, understand what they're looking for. But ultimately, to try to be them or emulate them, or even like trick them into thinking that you are understanding them, is just, it's a waste of time. Like, ultimately, it's never going to ring true for every teenager. And there's going to be so many teenagers who sit here and go, that's absurdity. So just write the story that you want to tell, what gets your message across, what makes your characters interesting, and like focus on writing a book that's good, not necessarily one that's going to be relatable to a 15-year-old.
So all of you are giving a voice to untold experiences in young romance for queer teens, whether it's first loves, promposals, navigating sex or intimacy, or fake dating. As you wrote in your books, did you use any popular romance tropes? If so, why? And how did you make it your own?
I'll go first because the trope is right in the title. So obviously, Honey and Issues Guide to Fake Dating, the main trope is fake dating. And one of the reasons why I just really wanted to write this trope is, well, first of all, because I love the fake dating trope. I think it's super fun. But also, I had never really seen this being done with sapphic characters. And the only time when I kind of saw it was Faking It, the MTV TV show. And I wasn't a big fan of how they handled the trope and, bisexuality or sexuality in general in that show. So that was actually what kind of inspired me to write this book and to tackle this trope. So the entire book actually came from the trope, which I've never really done before when writing. So the trope came first and then everything else came after. And yeah, I love the fake dating trope because I think you can have so much inside just this one trope. You can have like your mutual pining, you can have like enemies to lovers, you can have all of that, and you can have all of the like nice, sweet moments of romance without actually getting the actual romance. So yeah, fake dating is the main trope. There's also a bunch of other tropes in this. It's a very tropey book, but fake dating is the main one.
I would say with the Sky Blues, there's a little blending of a few different tropes. I would say I hate to even say it because I feel like it sort of gives it away, but there's a little bit of a secret admirer thing happening. This isn't the Sky Blues, but I really love, I'm a huge fan of enemies to lovers, even though it's been done 400 million times. I will eat that up most of the time. And also childhood friends who were close as kids, and then you know the drill. They separate and then reunite as older teenagers or as adults. I think that's really cute and can be really lovely.
I don't know if there's a official name for this trope, but the cranky person, and then the person that's trying the chaos person that's trying to always get the cranky person to smile. That's one of my favorite tropes, and that's heavily featured in this book.
We can create the trope, cranky/chaos.
Yeah, cranky chaos.
So Meet Cute Diary is obviously tropes, Meet Cute Diary. But the whole concept of the book is a rom-com. So I ultimately knew that the first thing I wanted to focus on was just kind of bringing in a lot of those cutesy, magical tropes that get used a lot in straight and white romances that you never see with queer people of color usually. So that was a big thing, especially because I was I wanted to have a trans character who could kind of just navigate all those magical things that were kind of denied inherently, because people try to make this whole thing of oh, but if you don't pass, can anyone be into you? Because what's their sexuality? And I wanted to bypass all of that and bring the idea of no, trans people can look at somebody across the room and just magically have that same romance that you would get with a cis white straight character. So meet cutes are huge, and then I have fake dating, hate to love, which is a whole bunch of tropes, and it was just kind of my way of trying to reclaim those tropes for trans people of color.
I have an element of secret romance in mine, and I don't even really think of it as a secret romance. I think a lot of times in queer stories, when you do have a secret romance, it's because the characters are at different stages of their acceptance and coming out. So one wants to be out and the other one doesn't want to be out. And that's definitely the case in my book, where the love interest comes from a conservative and religious family, and he doesn't think he can come out until after he leaves for college, or I don't think he's going to go to college. But he sees sports as a way out. And so when writing, I didn't want that to be the conflict. So Spencer, who's my main character, because he's trans and has experienced coming out himself, he understands why Justice, who is a love interest, can't come out. And so that's not really the conflict. So I liked having that secret romance trope, but being able to sort of subvert it and not fall into what has traditionally been done, especially with queer characters.
I'm loving hearing all the tropes that y'all used, because whenever I started writing my book, I had no idea what tropes were, and so this is really cool to hear. But I think besides the obvious mutuals to lovers that kind of happens in this book, I think the main one that really started out as me just thinking I made a clever decision with some names became clearer that it was actually a trope I was using as I was learning who these characters are, and that's the sun and moon personality types. I don't necessarily know if Jules is the pinnacle of what a moon character is or can be, aside from maybe his timidity and coming into figuring out what being openly himself looks like. But with Matt, for sure, like he's the dictionary definition of sunlight in like every single way. And we also have like just every single version of like all the firsts in the book, but not necessarily every single one of them is between the two of them, as it pertains to like first things. So that was really fun too.
So speaking of tropes, what are some of your other favorite tropes that you'd love to see or write in queer stories?
Robbie beat me to it, but enemies to lovers is my trope. It's my brand. I need everyone to look at me and just think enemies to lovers is my thing. Because like if I ever write another book that like does not have enemies to lovers in it, like I've probably failed myself. So
I'm waiting for your enemies to lovers book because I also love the enemies to lovers trope. And you said you would give me like the one that I'm looking for.
I you know what? Remind me, I'll send it to you. I have one for you.
Yeah, send it to me. Hopefully I'll have the time to read it. But yeah, I also love enemies to lovers. Honestly, like as I said, in Honey and Issue, there's a bunch of different tropes. And the reason for that is because I really love tropes. I love leaning into them. And I think especially because there are so few like tropey sapphic books. I mean, there are so few tropey queer books in general, but tropey sapphic books are just so rare. And that's what I just really, really love doing. And that's what I would love to like keep doing. I'd love to keep taking like different tropes, no matter what they are. I believe that every trope can be well written. So, you know, if there's a trope that I don't like, I'm sure that somebody here can probably do a really good job writing it. So yeah, I would just love to write all the tropes for sapphic characters.
I like them a little different. I love like friends to lovers with my entire heart, and just like really all the ways that it can be shaped into something even more dramatic, whether it's like lifelong friends to lovers, or like friends to enemies to lovers, or friends to rivals to lovers. Like I think even the second chance trope tied to maybe even like a platonic sort of relationship that then transitions to a romantic one would be just like everything I ever wanted in my life. And like I love anything that pertains to like friendship, true love. And I'd also just love to see more rom-coms, and like also anything competitive, just anything competitive. Like I love when someone can lose, and like I love someone who really wants to win, and I love to see like how that can play a part in a romance arc. Like I think that sounds so chaotic, and I just love that.
Johnny, you said rivals to lovers, and immediately my head was like, oh, yes, that's what I love. I love rivals to lovers. Like compete against each other for love.
Yeah, I think, and if not enemies, well, I love enemies to lovers, but I think friends to lovers is underrated, and I love that trope.
I would also say it's also so annoying when I hear like straight or cisgender people complaining about like queer books that are like too tropey or cliche, because there's 400 million like straight cisgender like books, films, whatever, that are the same exact narrative arc like over and over and over again with the same tropes, and then you have like two queer stories that are like similar-ish and everyone calls it out. So I'm with y'all with like lean into the tropes. Every single trope can be remade a million interesting ways, but just make it queer and make it fun. So yes, co-sign all of you.
So let's talk about firsts. There are first kisses, first loves, and first sexual or intimate experiences. Not all of your works touch upon sex, but some do, and the ongoing conversations around sex and teenage coming-of-age experiences is important to touch on. So how do YA writers balance including sex and intimacy in a YA novel in a way that's appropriate for the readers while also staying true to real life?
So one of the things that I found frustrating about a lot of romance and YA novels was how good it was, like how perfect it was, you know? Like suddenly these teenagers who were virgins know exactly what to do. And so I really wanted to explore sex on the page, but in a funny, more realistic way. And like sex is funny sometimes. Like, you know, it's awkward and it's weird and it's squishy and it's like, you know, and I just wanted to explore like that honesty about sex. Like it can be silly and it can be funny. It can also be really sexy and romantic. But I really was kind of tired of just seeing these like perfect, you know, sexy scenes in YA books where I was like, nobody knows what they're doing when you're first doing it. Like, so that's what I really wanted to explore. Yeah.
In my opinion, like when talking about writing, I guess like good, truthful sex, like I think we know. I think it's reasonable to say any respectful adult writing teenagers having sex has the capability to know romance and telling a story and impact from just being weird. And like that doesn't come from the words or anything, but it comes from intention. And like it's a really complicated conversation, I think. But like at the same time, because at the same time, like you don't necessarily need the romance or the impactful reasoning to have sex. Like that's just as valid. They don't have to be there. But I think it needs to matter to the story. Like ultimately, if it's going to be on the page in some sort of detail, it needs to have some significance to the main character. And I think having so much YA in first person, even more so, asks for that. Not just like in the physical ways a main character is experiencing this. Like you can include that for sure, but like even if it's not, like there's going to be mental and emotional implications of this experience before, during, and afterward that I think need to be explored for the sake of the story and for any young person reading the story. And I think that's just where we have to start with it. Like, of course, they can divert in a lot of different ways and experiences where sex comes up, but at its core, like writing for teenagers means that the volume of thought in their head is like all the way up. And that just needs to be as much a part of it as any actual action of having sex. And like I usually go to examples that I think are really good, which in my head I would look at like this is kind of an epic love story by Kason Callender and Today, Tonight, Tomorrow by Rachel Lynn Solomon. I think those do a really good job of like portraying sex in just a really positive and great way on page. And like if I wanted a good example of how that should look, I would go to like those two first.
I agree with everything that Johnny and Margot said, but I just want to add, like, I actually think one of the YA books that I've read that I think deals with sex really well is actually Johnny's book, because I think it does it in a way that feels very honest, and it just feels very true to the characters, and not just the characters who are having sex, but also the side characters who are like talking about it and like interested in it, making fun of the characters for it. Like it just felt very honest to the story, very relevant, and yeah, just very true to all the characters. So I really loved the way you handled sex in your book.
I'm gonna go cry now, but thank you.
Like, I'm somebody who doesn't really do a lot of sex in like the stuff I write, because for me, sex doesn't resonate with me as part of the teen experience because I'm ace, and that was not even something I really wanted at that age. But I also think I think part of the problem is just like people kind of treat sex as either like this one thing that's done in this one very Christian, straight, white kind of like way, or like something that shouldn't be talked about at all. And so I think like with Meet the Diary, it was important for me to like have like Noah kind of like acknowledge like sex is a thing and like tons of people are having it, and like, you know, I may not be one of those people who wants to have it, but also like that's still a thing that people do, and there are people who do and there are people who don't, and they kind of all come to it at their own time. And so like I think it's just kind of, I feel like the big thing that we're missing just in regards to like sex and YA is just the spectrum of how people approach it. Whether that's not wanting sex at all, whether that's wanting sex but only casually, whether that's, you know, this being like the biggest thing in your life. I think we kind of narrow it down to like one presentation, and I feel like that's kind of where a lot of the harm comes from.
Yeah, my book doesn't have any sex in it, and I was watching a show that it was like a show made for teens, and they were just having sex all the time, and for me, I didn't know who the show was for, because as an adult, like I felt uncomfortable watching teens, even though they're actors obviously, but like teens have sex, and then, you know, growing up, we had one TV in the living room, so I wouldn't have watched that show with my parents growing up as a teen. But I loved, Margot, you said like a few answers earlier when you were talking about your character exploring her sexuality, and I loved what you said, and Johnny, about the intention behind writing. And I think YA authors have this opportunity to kind of get into the head of the teen character, explore the emotions, explore all the awkwardness, show things like navigating intimacy, show things like consent in a way that you can't really see on screen. And books are things that, you know, teenagers can read individually in their bedrooms, and they can kind of learn. I don't think writers should be forced to teach and it shouldn't be educational, but there definitely is a responsibility when writing sex on the page for teens.
Yeah, I would totally echo a lot of what y'all said, especially Emery and Isaac. I think as long as you are staying true to the character, like some teens are having zero sex and aren't interested in sex, some teens are having a ton of sex and are very, very sexual. And I think as long as you know your character and reflect their own truths, that's really important. I know for me, I was sort of surprised after I had my advanced reader copies for The Sky Blues, and I had feedback once from a person that was kind of surprised at the mention of pornography. There's like 2 scenes where Sky is looking at porn, and it's very like kind of off the cuff remark, and it's very accessible for readers. And I was kind of irked by the fact that someone like got upset by that, because it's like, of course, I shouldn't say of course, but like teenagers look at porn, and porn is like in their world, and so I almost found it offensive that they would find it offensive. But in general, yeah, I think it's important that that you just stay true to your characters, and just when it comes to sex, just like so many things, when it comes to a character's building out who a character is, just stay true to who they are.
So we all kind of touched on it a little bit, but how can we challenge stereotypes and sex shaming that's present in media surrounding queer sex, love, and dating?
So
go ahead, Isaac.
One thing is we need to find a better word other than clean for books that don't contain sex or don't contain like other topics that are more mature. And I don't know what that word is, but we have to stop using the word clean because that implies the other books are dirty, which they are not.
I definitely resonate with the fact that like we as writers aren't required to teach. Like I in no way have a teaching degree or a degree in like biology or anything like that. But I know that I also have a responsibility to the audience that I write for. And just like living in a state where our education system can't be trusted to provide adequate sex ed for even straight cis people, like the least I can do if I'm making the choice to include sex in my book is to provide examples that are healthy and positive. And in 1500 Miles from the Sun, there's this scene that's been talked about to me from like readers a couple of times, and it involves the 4 C's for good gay sex, which are consent, communication, cleanliness, and condoms and lube. And like while it's presented in this sort of like humorous way, it also allows for Jules and Matt to break this tension that like comes with having sex for the first time for Jules, and like and it should be okay, like asking for consent and like, is this okay? And telling each other, like, talk to me, communicate. And I mean, like, there's literally douching in the book. Like, I want young people, and especially like queer Chicana teens and like QTBI POC teens to know that like sex and physical intimacy can be wonderful and powerful and meaningful, but like it can also be just as much fun and awkward. And like I really wanted that to be the message in that.
I second everything that Isaac and Johnny said. As always seconding everyone. But just to add, I think it's very difficult for a single author or a single book to challenge stereotypes that have existed for a long time. So I think the most important thing that we as authors can do is write the stories that feel authentic to us and the experiences that feel authentic to us. And hopefully, publishing allows enough diversity in so that, people can read these books and understand that, queer people are not just having sex one way, or, some queer teens are not having sex at all. So, there needs to be that diversity of experience and diversity of stories, and publishing needs to allow that, because that is really the only way that we're going to challenge these stereotypes.
Yeah, like I'm right there with Adiba. Like that's my thought process whenever it comes to like how do we defeat stereotypes? And it's like no one person can. Like these stereotypes become so embedded in our culture over time. And ultimately, like all we can do is keep contributing to the canon, keep expanding people's worldview, and like hope that publishing will allow enough stories to get enough readership that people can see enough different opinions and they can kind of start to expand their thoughts and realize that, we're not all the same, and the way we go about it is always going to be different.
Yeah, chiming in with both of those sentiments, I agree with you, but it's not up to any one writer to challenge those stereotypes. I would say one thing that would help go towards challenging those stereotypes is if publishers started putting a lot more marketing money towards these books that do challenge those stereotypes and putting a lot more support. Like, it's not enough to just publish them and that's it. Like, there needs to be a lot more support for those types of stories. And I think that will go a lot longer than any one book that got maybe a 2,000 print run could ever go.
Absolutely. I think there's been a lot of really great points made. I would also add to it, it's really frustrating to see the double standards between queer stories and straight cis stories in terms of like the level of sexuality on the page and how it's viewed. I know in like my parents' town in Michigan, right now there's like this big controversy around the high school library putting all of the LGBTQ stories, regardless of how sexual or not, into like a restricted mature section where you need a parent permission to like even get the books out, which is horrifying. And it just speaks to this idea that anything that's queer themed at all is like in nature more like explicitly X-rated, and that's especially true with any sort of queer sex on the page. So I think it's just about pushing back against those double standards, especially allies, straight cis people. Please push back when you hear that sort of double standard. It shouldn't be on us to do all the pushing back. But I think that, yeah, is just important in making sure that, yeah, we don't view queer sex as anything abnormal, but just a part of the everyday teen experience.
So coming of age stories will always be necessary, but especially for queer teens and adults who sometimes come out later in life and didn't get to have a proper teenage coming of age experience. If your readers could take any message away from your book, what would it be? And if you could give a bit of advice to aspiring queer writers writing contemporary coming of age stories, what would you say?
The message of my story is basically just like whatever happy ending you want is the happy ending you deserve. It's not your place to water yourself down or feel like you have to compromise just because you're queer, just because you're a person of color, just because you're trans. Like, if this is what you want for yourself, you have the right to, you deserve that. You deserve to find somebody who's going to treat you the way that you deserve to be treated. And I guess my message to any queer writers is essentially the same message. Like, whatever story you want to tell is the story you deserve to tell. You don't have to let publishing tell you that you have to write your story a certain way. And ultimately, like, there are going to be hurdles and it's going to be hard. But at the end of the day, like, I published a trans multiracial rom-com that didn't exist until I got to do it. And so, like, it sucks. It sucks so bad being the first. It sucks so bad. But like, if that's what you want, like if you want to put that book out in the world, like, don't let them tell you that you can't. If that's the story that you want to tell, you deserve to be able to tell that story.
My message in my book is essentially the exact same as Emery's, but it is, that you should love yourself fully for who you are, and it doesn't matter if there are people, whether they're your friends, your family, whoever, and they are telling you that you need to dull down a part of yourself. That's not important, because you deserve to be fully who you are, and you deserve love for that, and you deserve to love yourself. And advice that I would give to aspiring writers is to keep pushing, because I do think it is very difficult being a queer writer in the publishing industry. Like Emery said, E was someone who broke down doors, and I will say that I am also someone who often feels like I've had to push boundaries and break down doors, because I am writing Bengali characters and queer Bengali Muslim characters, which again, like, nobody else is really doing. There's only like 3 South Asian people in publishing right now writing like queer YA. So it can be lonely, it can be frustrating, but there are people like me and Emery and other people on this panel who are trying to break down those barriers, who are trying to tell those stories. So hopefully, when you get here, you won't be the first, but even if you are, there are people here who are willing to support you and willing to help you break down those barriers.
Okay, that's such a good answer. For me, I would say, to answer the first question, I think found family, even though found family is in a lot of queer books, that was definitely a really important message I wanted to get across. I think it's important for not just queer teens, but any young person and everyone really, to know that you can choose your own family. You do not have to be around people who don't love you unconditionally for who you are because of your queer identity. So that was really important. For the second question, for my second answer, I would say I guess it's sort of twofold, because number one, I don't think you have to be a social media star to get published. Like a lot of folks, there's a lot of pressure to like have big follower accounts and whatever and be super duper active. And yeah, that can be helpful and it can be great, but I think the primary thing is to just tell a good story. So first of all, then the second part of that answer is, if you are on social media and you are interacting with other people, like I've found some really great people, some people on this call who are wonderful writers who I've connected with, and it's been so wonderful to be able to connect with other queer writers in social spaces and have that support and solidarity. And so if you are using Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, whatever, I would just recommend making connections where it makes sense to find those connections and find those support, because it can not just be beneficial in the industry, but just personally be wonderful to have those people in your life. So, yeah.
I guess the message that you take away from reading Fresh is the message I intended you to take away from reading Fresh. No, just kidding. It's okay to be horny on Maine. I mean, my book is a comedy, and it's really just about that. So it's cool to be horny on Maine. Also, my advice to writers too. But also to echo what Robbie was saying, for aspiring queer writers is to like connect with the writing community, the queer writing community especially, and also support the books that are out there. Continue to read them, promote them, support them, because the more success that the queer books that are out now can achieve, the more doors will be open for the next generation of queer writers.
Everyone has had such great answers. I would say the message for my book is it's okay to come out on your own time and in your own terms. And then for queer authors who are writing contemporary, I think everybody really has said what I would say. I think in the panel we've all said how we've seen either tropes or plot or storylines that we didn't like, and then we wrote our own books that subverted them or changed them or made it in a way that felt true and authentic to us. So I would encourage other authors to do that as well. Another thing is, I really resonate with both Emery and Adiba about being like one of the first authors writing the books that you're writing. And I'm stealing this from somebody else. I don't know who it is, but I attribute it to them. But the idea that when the door opens for you, you have to prop it open and get as many people in as you can. And I think authors are that I found are really generous people and who understand how difficult it is to get a step into publishing. And there are a lot of resources. I'm not enough, but there are a lot of resources out there for diverse writers, and definitely check those out.
I would say it's tough out there, and like especially for QT people, like it's fucking tough out there, and that like if you as a reader know at all what it is to live Jules's life, like I hope that this book makes you feel seen and that it makes you feel loved, and that you leave it knowing that you are strong and beautiful and enough for this world just as you are. And like, even if it's just for a while, alone in your room between you and Jules and Matt and Jordan and Excel and Lou and Rolly and Pina and Sochi, like I hope that like you don't feel lonely in that experience. I hope that you feel like there's support there, and we'll get through it. Like we'll get through it. And on a lighter note, like don't wait for tomorrow. Go and slide into your crush's DMs today. That would be the other one. And I think, like, specifically to writers, I would say 3 things. One, the first one is fuck imposter syndrome. The second one is to write truthfully. And the third one, for contemporary writers specifically, don't include a specific year if you don't have to, because time is an illusion.
Well, thank you so much to Johnny Garzavia, Robbie Couch, Margot Wood, Adiba Jagardar, Isaac Fitzsimons, and Emery Lee for this incredible conversation. Where can readers find more about you and your work?
You can find me on Twitter at Johnny Escribe. Escribe is like write in Spanish. And then on Instagram at Johnny Instas. My website is johnnygarzaVia.com, and you can go and order my debut novel, 1500 Miles from the Sun, at your favorite indie or on bookshop.com.
You can find me on the internet. I'm just at Ravi Couch. I think on Twitter, yes, there's an underscore between my first and last name on Twitter. And it's couch just like a furniture, sofa, C-O-U-C-H. And yeah, in my bio, there's a link to purchase The Sky Blues.
You can find me at adiba.jagardar.com. On Twitter, I am at adiba_J. And on Instagram, I'm at DIBS_J. And Honey and Issue is up now, so you can go buy that wherever you buy books.
I'm on Instagram and Twitter and sort of TikTok. And Fresh is out August 3rd, and it's available where all your favorite books are sold.
I am also on Twitter and Instagram. Twitter is at Emery Lee Who. Instagram is at Emery Lee Books. You can also find me on TikTok occasionally. I don't even remember my handles. I think it's Emery Lee Who. And my website is emeryleebooks.com. If you go on there, you can also find the partnered indies that I sign copies with. If you want to get a signed copy, or you can also buy my book anywhere books are sold.
You can find me online on Twitter at Isaac Fitzy. You can find me on Instagram at Isaac Fitz Books, and my website is also isaacfitzbooks.com. And my book, The Passing Playbook, which is there, is out June 1st, so it should be out by now, and you can buy it at retail stores.
And I'm Katie Krause from Katie Reads Books, and thank you for joining us at Pride Book Fest 2021.